Good day, everyone. I am Zelner Montes, and I'm going to report about Edward Said's book Orientalism. But first, who is Edward Said? Edward Said, who has died at the age of 67, was one of the leading literary critics of the last quarter of 20th century. As professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University in New York, he was widely regarded as the outstanding representative of the post-structuralist left in America. He was also the founding figure of the postcolonial studies, owing to the extraordinary influence of his germinal critical study, Orientalism. Above all, he was the most articulate and visible advocate of Palestinian cause in the United States, where it earned him many enemies. Edward Said's Orientalism is his most famous work, which was released in 1978. It has influenced about half a dozen established disciplines like literary studies, history, anthropology, sociology, regional studies, mainly Middle Eastern studies, and comparative religion. In Orientalism, Said examines Western representation of Middle Eastern societies and cultures. The book earned him universal acclaim for innovative and provocative explorations of interrelationship between text, literary, and otherwise. Said examines these works in terms of social, political, and economic context from which they emerge. Edward Said takes a continental interdisciplinary approach to literary criticism in his book using the principles of phenomenology, existentialism, and French structuralism to trace the connections between literature and politics. His theories and methods have had a tremendous impact on American academic circles, particularly in literary theory and cultural studies. Said's central concern in Orientalism are the multiple relationships between the act of writing and cultural politics, language, and power. He seeks to show how Western journalists, novelists, and scholars have helped to build a dominant and hostile image of Eastern culture as inferior, stagnant, and degenerate. He also attempts to show the extent to which this depiction permeates Western culture. The West used this depiction to justify its imperialist policies in the Middle East. Terms used in Orientalism: Orient, Oriental, Orientalist, Orientalism. In Orientalism, Edward Said has used various derivatives of the word Orient, which literally means the East, the direction which the sun rises. Geopolitically, Orient signifies the Middle East, Asia, and the Far East, territories that were once part of one or another European empire. Said uses the word Orient to signify a system of representation framed by political forces that brought the Orient or the East into Western empire, Western learning, and Western consciousness. The West uses the word in its relation to the East. It is the mirror image of the inferior, the alien, or the other, to the Occident or the West. Oriental. It is a noun form which means an individual or people of the Orient. As an adjective, the word signifies anything belonging to the East, like Oriental landscape, Oriental literature, Oriental attitude, and at many others. Orientalist. It means a person who studies or writes about the Orient. Orientalism. It is used academically to signify Western doctrines and theses about the Orient. Said also makes it clear that he is not attempting to cover the whole area. He focuses on how American, English, and French scholars have approached the Arab societies of the Middle East and North Africa. The period he covers in his book extends from the late 18th century to the present. The concept of alter ego and other. Edward Said's starting point in Orientalism is that the existence and development of every culture impels the existence of different and inevitably competitive other or alter ego like night and day, heads and tails, darkness and light, or good and bad. Therefore, Europe, in attempting to construct its self-image, created the Middle East as the ultimate other. The Middle East and the West do not correspond to any stable reality that exists as a natural fact but are merely products of construction. In Said's work, there are several definitions of Orientalism. First, as a style of thought. Second, as a field of academic study. Third, as a commercial institution. And last, as a discourse. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Said argued that this distinction emphasized the supremacy of the Occident versus the inferiority of the Orient. Second, Orientalism is a field of academic research that includes everyone who teaches, investigates, writes about the Orient. Third, the Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, which begins in the 18th century. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Moreover, it is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western culture and experience. In light of this perception, the Middle East is static, unalterable, and can't define itself. Therefore, through Orientalism, the West took it upon itself to represent the Orient and by doing so, open it to exploitation. The very purpose of Orientalism is to take control of the Orient and take away from it any ability to speak for itself. Said maintained that it is the stereotypes and prejudice that determine the Western representation of the Orient. Last is Orientalism as a discourse. Edward Said would also describe Orientalism as a discourse, a definition he takes from the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault. Foucault defined discourse as a system of thought that governs the knowledge obtained by a person. This knowledge is a paraphrase of preconceived notions and ideas. So, a discourse is the product of interaction between power and knowledge, interconnected in a never-ending circle. In Foucault views, knowledge is power and also the way of gaining power. Edward Said, following the ideas of Foucault, focused on the relationship between power and knowledge. He argued that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one can comprehend the hugely systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even construct the Orient politically, militarily, sociologically, scientifically, imaginatively, and ideologically during the post-Enlightenment period. In Orientalism, Edward Said builds up his argument and analysis in three long chapters. First, the chapter 1, the scope of Orientalism. Chapter 2, Oriental structures and restructures. Chapter 3, Orientalism now. So here is a brief summary of all three chapters in Said's Orientalism. First, chapter 1, the scope of Orientalism. The scope of Orientalism covers all the dimensions of the subject, both in terms of historical experience and time period. Moreover, It also covers the subject in terms of political as well as philosophical themes. Said provides a review of pre-18th century writing on the Muslim Near East and socio-political impact of Napoleon's invasion in Egypt in 1798. According to him, the East was viewed as a textual universe for the West. The European Orientalist had keen interest in classical rather than contemporary periods of the Eastern culture. Chapter 2, Oriental Structures and Restructures. In this chapter, Said traces the development of modern Orientalism by presenting a broadly chronological description. He also attempts to trace it by describing a set of devices usually common to works of popular artists, poets, and scholars. Said presents a Said presents a review of the French and English traditions of the study of Muslim Near East during the 19th century and further up to the World War I. For this purpose, his major focus is on the works of French Orientalists such as Sylvester de Sacy and works of English Orientalists like Edward Lane's Account of the Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, 1836. Furthermore, in this chapter, Edward Said endeavors to demonstrate how Orientalism has influenced and affected the Western perception of Arab, Middle East, and Middle Eastern perception of themselves. Chapter 3, Orientalism Now. This chapter of Orientalism begins at the point where its predecessor had left off. It means around 1870. This period is characterized with great colonial expansion to the Orient, culminating in the Second World War. The last section of this chapter characterizes the shift from British and French to American hegemony. It presents the current social realities of Orientalism in the USA. So it begins this chapter with a discussion of Orientalism in 1920s and 1930s. For this purpose, he reviews the career of leading Islamicists at the time like French scholar Louis Massignon and English historian Hamilton Gibb. Edward Said takes note of lectures of Hamilton Gibb as director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, especially his views on Arab mind and the aversion of the Muslim from thought process of rationalism, referring to Islam as Mohammedanism. Under the subtitle The Last Phase, Edward Said reviews post-war to Orientalism as the United States came to be the center of the activity with regards to the East. In this latest phase, the highly qualified American area specialists took the lead replacing the earlier philologists. Edward Said examines the role of these area specialists of the East. According to him, they help to perpetuate the dynamics of Orientalism in the representation of Islam and Arabs in four categories. These four categories are popular image and social science representation, public relation policy, merely Islam, and last, to see the Orient as an imitation West. In the first category, Said discusses the popular images and social science representation of the East. He argues that the treatment of Arabs and Islam by area specialists are predictably and routinely negative as they derive the transference of the popular anti-Semitic animus from Jews to Arabs. Said asserts it is the academic studies that supports these negative images. These images are actually the negative caricatures of Arab and Islamic cultures. Second category, the public relations policy. In the second category of misrepresentation of Arabs and Islam, Said takes on the American public relation policy. It, it is this policy by which he says that contemporary scholars try to perpetuate the traditions set by European Orientalists. For example, the racist discourse and dogmas of Eastern Renan in 1840s. He bases his argument on the work of Gustav von Granschbon. He was a German Orientalist who entertained an almost virulent dislike for Islam. Said finds the following dogmas implicit in the works of Granschbon and other Orientalists. Absolute difference between the Occident and the Orient. Absolute difference between the Occident, which is rational and superior, and the Orient, which is aberrant and inferior. The superiority of the abstractions regarding the Orient against direct evidence from the contemporary Orient itself. The recognition that the Orient is to be feared and controlled. Third category, merely Islam. Said labels the third category of the contemporary Orientalist representations as merely Islam. He attacks the allegedly inherent inability of the Muslim Near Orient to be as richly human as the West. He also cites the views of a prominent political scientist. According to this view, the Muslim mind is capable of only 4 out of 8 human thought processes. To this, he adds presumptions of President of the Middle East Studies Association that since the Arab language is much given to rhetoric, the Arab are consequently incapable of true thought. Last category, to see Orient as an imitation of West. The fourth category, Said places and takes on contemporary Western Orientalist presumption that Orient is an imitation West. He also highlights their efforts to encourage the Westerners to judge themselves by Western criteria and to work for achieving the Western goals. Said deplores that the modern Orient has fallen for the bait and is participating in its own Orientalizing. Said winds up his discussion of Orientalism by briefly addressing the positive side to the problem of reliable scholarship in the field of Orientalism. He hopes that the honest work on the Arabs and Near Orient is likely to be done by scholars whose allegiance is to a discipline defined intellectually and not to a field like Orientalism defined either canonically, imperially, or geographically. Concepts of Orientalism. How Edward Said handles it. In his book, Edward Said clearly stated that Orientalism was not the product of colonial rule, but as a pattern of knowledge. It preceded colonialism. The vision of Orient, Said stated that existed as far as back as the ancient Greeks. However, prior to the colonial era, Orientalism was a literary discourse bound in a tradition of writers, text, research, and conceptualization. Said pointed out that the Persians by Aeschylus as an example of early attempts to create an Orient. Nevertheless, Said stated that it is fairly recent that Orientalism has become a science or an extended body of knowledge and tradition. He mentioned two 18th century intellectuals who spearheaded the transition of Orientalism from literary to scientific knowledge. One is Abraham Hyacinth Anquetil Duperron, and the other is William Jones. These two scholars took Orientalism out of its literary roots and supplanted it with a seemingly scientific and objective one. This, their emphasis was no longer on the description of the exotic but rather on the comprehension of it. According to Said, the knowledge or understanding gained through Orient scientific study leads directly to control and power over the Orient. He provided a clear example of this interaction by discussing Lord Balfour's speech to the House of Commons in 1910. In this speech, Lord Balfour clearly justified Britain's presence and involvement in Egypt. So in a very basic sense, knowledge is power. It is powerful since it is privileged only to the European and not to the Oriental itself. This basic assumption is that the Orientalist knows the Orient better than the Orientalists do themselves. This, this overwhelmingly paternalistic attitude leads him to inevitable and logical conclusion of approaching the Orient under this power. Edward Said's ideas of Orientalism. So, one of Said's central ideas in Orientalism is that knowledge about the East is generated not through actual facts, but through imagined constructs. These constructs imagined Eastern societies as fundamentally similar and sharing the characteristics that are not possessed by Western societies. Thus, a priori, a priori, meaning it relates to or denoting reasoning or knowledge which proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than from observation or experience. So, this knowledge set up the Orient as the antithesis of the West. Said argued that such knowledge is built through literary text and historical records which are often limited in terms of their understanding of the authenticity of the life in the Middle East. Said also claimed a subtle, persistent Eurocentric prejudice against the Arabo-Islamic people and their culture. He further said that a long tradition of false and romanticized images of Asia and the Middle East in the Western culture has served as an implicit justification for Europe and America's colonial rule and imperial ambitions. Also, Said denounced the practice of Arab elites who internalized the American and British Orientalist ideas of Arabic culture. Although he restricted his discussion to academic study of the history and culture of Middle Eastern Africa and Asia, Said clearly asserted that Orientalism is and does not merely represent a significant dimension of modern political and intellectual culture. Edward Said's major claims in Orientalism. There are four central claims that Said's book made. First, while Orientalism presents itself as an objective field of study, it was used to justify the political domination of the East by the West. Second, Orientalism was actually more about defining itself through the mirror of the East rather than it was about objectively studying it. Third, points 1 and 2 are produced and reinforced by viewing the Orient as a homogeneous group. Homogeneous group. This essentialist thinking was a false way of viewing people groups and their culture. Edward Said also rejects the validity of the terms Orient and Occident. Still, he employs them because this is how the argument has been framed by the Orientalists. Lastly, Orientalist scholars are the product of the system they came from. Due to this, they can't help but to misrepresent the other. Therefore, what we need is for the subaltern to speak for itself. To sum it up, Said outlined a theory where Orientalism arose out of a need for the West to define itself as the opposite of a counterbalancing entity. Europe found the counterbalancing entity in the Crusades to be the Orient. The West found itself in positions of political and military power over what it saw as the Orient and subsequently used this power to subjugate it. Developing alongside this power giving legitimacy and traction was the scholars of the Orient, the Orientalists. Once a tradition of superior values of the West and a static view of the Orient developed, the tradition crystallized, and it was and is nearly impossible to break free for any scholar inside the tradition. However, humans make their own history, and every history is in a constant state of flux and development. Thus, what is necessary is for each people group to speak for itself and create discourses of its own history. They must share and dialogue with the other people groups and the goal of true knowledge of the other and not merely political knowledge.